Hey guys, how are y'all? Good to see everybody. Well, I don't care if you're here, Paul. Definitely wasn't talking to you. All right. Excited to continue the story from last week. Just a couple reminders, right? First of all, the geography matters here not as a matter of trivia. It matters in helping us land the story on solid ground, right? This is part of the project for us in this little mini series is to help land these stories that tend to hover above the earth in the realm of real, but not really real. We want to land them on ground. So we'll take another brief look at some of the geography. I want to remind you of how the story ended last week because we didn't actually talk about it. There's a question that the disciples asked at the end of the journey last week, at the end of the calming of the storm, that matters not only for last week's story, but for this week's story. It provides a transition. So we're going to take a look at that. Then we're going to take a look at a story that makes a lot of us uncomfortable, I think, in a lot of different ways. But it's one of those stories that's been just so fascinating, at least for me, and I hope to pique your interest on that. So if you've got your phone, if you want to look at a map of Israel, you can Google that, use Google Earth or whatever your map app of choice is. On the screen, they've got an image of Israel there. We're going to zoom in on the Sea of Galilee again. And one of the things that we talked about last week is the northwest side of the Sea of Galilee is the Jewish side of the Sea of Galilee. And up at the top of the Sea of Galilee on the northern edge, there's something called the Evangelical Triangle, Bethsaida, Capernaum, and Chorazin. This is where Jesus spent, I don't know, some crazy percentage, like 75% of his ministry takes place in this little area. And that's where he was before our story last week. So he's on the northwest side of the Sea of Galilee. That's the Jewish side. He says to his disciples, let's go to the other side. He's talking about going to the eastern shore of the Sea of Galilee, to the Decapolis. This is the Gentile side of the Sea of Galilee. Another way to think about this is the northwest side's the good side. The east side's the bad side. You got the good guys, you got the bad guys. That's how simple the world was. On the east side, or on the west side, you've got the Jews who are trying to bring about the kingdom of God. They yearn for a Messiah. They yearn for God's land to belong to God's people once again. On the eastern side, you have the bad guys. You've got the Romans. It's controlled by the Roman 10th Legion. They are building the Decapolis, which is a showcase of Roman authority and culture. And Jesus says, let's go to the other side. So we talked last week at length about Jesus's desire to go across the tracks, so to speak. And even as he's making his way there, there is a storm that because of the weather patterns, one of the things we can see, I think really interestingly, is even the storm is trying to keep him from going over there because there's something on the other side that doesn't want any part of Jesus. And that's what we're going to look at this morning. But at the end of last week's story, Mark, you can go on to that next slide. At the end of last week's story, I want to read to you what happens. This is after Jesus calms the storm. This is after he says, why are you afraid? And have you still no faith? Listen to what he says. And they were filled with great awe and said to one another, who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him? They're asking an identity question. Isn't that an interesting question for the disciples to ask? By this point, they've already seen Jesus do a thing or two. They've seen him heal the paralytic. They've seen him heal a man with a withered hand. They've seen the baptism cleanse the leper. They've seen Jesus do some things already, but they're still really trying to ask the who question. They're still really wondering who has the power to do something like that. And what I want to suggest is that's the perfect question for us to lead into the story that we're going to read this week, because I think it's a direct response. In many ways, it's a direct response to that question. Who then is this? So this is the very next verse at the beginning of chapter 5. If you're following along, we're going to make our way through really the first 20 verses. So we'll cover a little bit more territory this week than we did last week. But listen for some of these details that start to pop up as Jesus makes landfall after the storm is calmed. They came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes, or your translation may say the Gadarenes or the Gergesenes. And when they stepped out of the boat, immediately a man out of the tombs with an unclean spirit met him. There's almost a sense that, at least I think that the immediacy of this encounter, to me, speaks to this is why Jesus was going. One of the questions that we asked last week is, why go to the other side? And we made some guesses about Jesus going to the other side because those are the folks who don't belong to God's people, and yet Jesus wants them. I think the immediacy of his encounter with this man speaks to Jesus's desire to go to the other side, just
I lost him.
I lost him too. I think they might have dropped off the Wi-Fi. That was on church Wi-Fi this morning.
He's frozen too. It looks like the video's frozen as well.
All right,
We all
Andy,
lost
just pick up where he was. Why don't you just keep going with this, buddy? You know that story, right?
Take over, Mark.
Yeah.
We are familiar with the story, right?
Yeah. You can find the same story in Luke chapter 8 and in Matthew chapter 8.
Jesus wins, right?
Oh, I see Matt come back on. I think he's got his Wi-Fi up. He had to do his hotspot.
We can't hear you, Matt.
Probably so.
you got me at all?
No, they can't hear anything.
It's a pretty good lesson so far, though.
Well, I heard still lagging. He's there, right?
I just saw him sign in down at the bottom.
I'm your intermediary today.
Yeah. Can you just hand him your phone, man?
Oh, gross. He's probably got.
Yeah, we've got his video.
Just wipe it down afterwards.
Yeah.
All right, how's that?
Yeah, there you go.
There, he's back. Now, what,
All right. Sorry, friends.
what book are you in?
I think we had another Wi-Fi failure here. We're in Mark chapter 5. Mark chapter 5. All right. So where were we? The reason that this story is uncomfortable is because there's a man with an unclean spirit. And I think before we move too much further, I think we're going to have to deal with this. Because as educated folk in America in the 21st century, dealing with demon possession is not high on our list of experiences, nor is it high on our list of priorities. And so I think we've got to figure out to some degree what's going on. And I want to make a suggestion, or maybe a request is another way to think about it. I want to ask you or invite you to take this at face value for a few minutes. Right, a lot of times, a lot of effort has been made to say, well, this isn't a real demon possession. In Scripture, when we see people who are possessed, it's more helpful for us to think about this as some sort of psychological disorder. That may well be what's happening. I'm not going to say definitively that that's not happening, but for the sake of our conversation, I want to invite you to take this at face value for a couple reasons. For one thing, it's what the text says. And I think on this case, I think we can trust that. This isn't the only time we see a demonic experience in the Gospels, and it makes us very uncomfortable, but it's in the text multiple times. And so I think for that reason, for a few minutes, I want to take this at face value. I want to invite you to take it at face value because the truth is that evil is real. And I wouldn't pretend to know all the ways that evil shows up. I wouldn't begin to articulate exactly how evil shows up, but I think you can look at the world today. I think we can look at the world today and be fairly certain that evil is a real thing. And so I think in that way, we can take this story at face value. And thirdly, I think without the demonic quality of this story, I think we would have to wonder what's the point, right? If this isn't if this man isn't possessed by a demon, if Jesus does not have an encounter with some force of evil, then what really do we have in this story? I would suggest that we don't really have much, other than maybe Jesus is a good counselor, and we believe that Jesus is more than a good counselor. So for a few minutes, you don't necessarily need to agree with me, and I'm comfortable with that, but for a few minutes, I want to invite you to take that at face value and consider the story from that perspective. At the end, we'll come back and you can push back on me on that. So listen to what happens as Jesus is immediately engaged when he sets foot on the eastern shore of the Sea of Galilee. He's immediately engaged by this guy with an unclean spirit. He lived among the tombs, and no one could restrain him anymore, even with a chain, for he had often been restrained with shackles and chains, but the chains he wrenched apart, and the shackles he broke into pieces, and no one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always howling and bruising himself with stones. What I want to suggest is that the setup for this story is perfectly crafted to repel every Jewish person that's ever lived. Here's why I say that. You're talking about somebody who, by the story's admission, is possessed by a demon, and so that's a non-starter if you're Jewish, really, if you're anybody. You're talking about somebody who Luke's account of this story leads off with him being naked, and being naked in this culture is not a thing that you do, right? This is a shame and honor culture. If you show up naked in public, Jewish folk are not going to have anything to do with you in this culture. It's just it's an issue of impurity. This is a man who is cutting himself, right? He's bruising himself with stones, which means that there's blood about, and Jewish folk don't deal with blood about. It creates an issue of ritual impurity. You talk about a man who's living among the dead, and just track with me this whole death and life thing. It's kind of a deal in the gospel sometimes, but this man is living among the dead. Jewish people don't have contact with dead folk, and this man is living with them. And he's isolated, right? He's living by himself. There's also this issue of howling, which I think is interesting. I wish I knew more about that. I want to know, what do you mean he's howling? All of this adds up to, I think the disciples are a better image of probably how I would respond, because I get the sense that they're very hesitant about this. Right? They look at this guy and he is everything that they know they are not supposed to engage. Everything is wrong with him. Nothing is right about him. And that's who runs to Jesus. And by the way, it says nobody's been able to subdue him. He's got these chains on, and no chain has been able to withhold him. But listen to what he does when he comes face to face with Jesus. This is in verse 6, if you're following along. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and bowed down before him, and he shouted at the top of his voice. I love that little detail. He doesn't just say it quietly. He shouts at the top of his voice. Isn't that fascinating? He says, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?" That's how he addresses Jesus. What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me. Do you remember the question that the disciples asked at the end of the calming of the storm story? Who then is this? Right, the men who have been with Jesus for some period of time are still wondering who Jesus is. But this man who's never met Jesus walks directly up to him and bows down. Remember, nobody's been able to subdue him. This man walks directly up to him, bows down, and says, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?" Right, there's an acknowledgement of identity here that I think is crucial. And I want you to hear how Jesus then goes on to respond. For Jesus had said to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." Then Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" And he replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." And he begged him earnestly not to send them out of the country. Now, there was a hillside. Remember last week we talked about the hillside on that eastern shore of the Sea of Galilee that causes the steep fall of that cold air. There's a hillside, and a great herd of swine was feeding. And the unclean spirit begged him, "Send us into the swine and let us enter them." So he gave them permission.
right? Jesus is the one giving them permission. And the unclean spirits came out and entered the swine, and the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea and were drowned in the sea. I mean, there's a lot going on there. That's an unusual event, if we can say it that way. Jesus says, come out of this man. He asked the guy his name. And the man says, Legion, in response, for we are many. Remember who's in control of this region of the Decapolis? It's the Roman 10th Legion. By the way, do you know what the mascot for the Roman 10th Legion is? It's the running boar. It's a running pig. Do you hear the play? I mean, isn't that a fascinating thing? What Jesus does in this encounter with a man possessed is plant a flag, even on the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee, a place that's dominated by pagan worship, a place that's dominated not just by a different culture, but a culture that is dominated in some way by evil. Jesus plants a flag and sends the evil in the symbol of the Roman 10th Legion into the sea. And he plants that flag and claims it as his own. He says, this is my land too. But he doesn't do it through violence. Right? He doesn't do it by killing the man. He does it by eradicating the evil. I think it's a very important distinction. I think, oh shoot, there was something else I was going to say. Andy, what was I going to say? You know most things. He's not responding. That's okay. All right, let's pick up. We want to end this story here. What time is it? We're almost done. The swineherds ran off and told it in the city and in the country, and then people came to see what it was that had happened. And they came to see Jesus and saw the demoniac sitting there. These people have known this guy for his life. Right? We're not talking about a population that moves all over the place. They know, everybody in this region knows this guy, because how could you not know the guy living among the dead, beating himself with stones and possessed by a demon? Everybody knows this guy. So they come and they want to see. They came to Jesus and they saw the demoniac sitting there clothed. So he's not naked anymore, and in his right mind. The very man who had had the legion, and they were afraid. Isn't that an interesting thing? It's an interesting response, yeah? They are afraid. This man has been healed, but the people are afraid. I want to spend some time on that in a minute. Those who had seen what had happened to the demoniac and to the swine reported it, and then they began to beg Jesus to leave their neighborhood. Isn't that fascinating? The devil, you know, right? They began to beg Jesus to leave. This man is finally in his right mind, and for the love of all that's holy, he's got clothes on for once. But they want Jesus to leave. And I think it's easy for us to look at that and say, well, how dumb is that? How foolish are these people? They just had an encounter with the Messiah, the Son of God, and they want him to leave. They just saw this incredible miracle and they want him to leave. But think about it. Try to put yourself in their shoes. Right? You know the power that this demon-possessed man has. He can break chains. He's weird. He makes you uncomfortable, but you at least know about it. This power that Jesus represents is an unknown. The power that Jesus represents is not one with which you've had an encounter before. And when we encounter a power that we haven't encountered before, fear's the natural response, because we just don't know. That's how they're responding. We just don't know, so we just want you to leave, Jesus. We'd rather you leave. Now, as he was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed by demons, this is verse 18, the man who had been possessed by demons begged him that he might be with him. Because, of course, this guy wants to go with Jesus. Jesus is getting back in the boat. The disciples are getting back in the boat. By the way, where have the disciples been this entire time? We don't hear anything about them. I'm not sure that they ever got out of the boat. I think they saw that guy run up to Jesus. They're like, I'm going to stay. I'm going to stay right here so we can make a quick exit. So this guy sees that Jesus is getting back in the boat. He runs up to him. He says, Jesus, I want to go with you. Because of course he says that. Isn't that what we say? Right? When Jesus changes our life, what we want to say to Jesus is, let's go. Take me back to the mountain so that I can have this mountaintop experience with you for the rest of my life. Of course that's Jesus, or of course that's the man's response, but listen to how Jesus responds. Jesus refused, and he said to him, "Go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and what mercy he has shown you." Jesus says, no, you're not coming back over to the other side. You're not coming back to the northwest side of the Sea of Galilee. You're going to stay in the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee. And I want you to tell people what's happened. That's such a beautiful image and challenge. I can imagine the guy wasn't too excited about that. But from our perspective, I think it's such a good reminder that when our lives have been changed, when we have been healed of whatever's going on in our life, Jesus's request of us, his invitation to us, is not that we retreat inside the walls of the church. Don't go back to the northwest side of the Sea of Galilee. Jesus's invitation to us is to stay where we are and tell somebody about it. Because you know somebody else is having the same challenge, right? You know somebody else has the same wounds that you have. And they need to hear the story of a God who came to the other side, planted his flag in the ground, and said, I want you. I heal you and I want you. All right, let me stop there for a minute. Let me take one quick look over my notes, make sure I didn't miss anything. Yep, that's where I want to stop.
You said something about getting back that they were afraid. They were afraid.
Michael's wondering if I want to circle back to the people were afraid. That to me, Michael, is the piece about when we encounter a power that we don't know about. I think it naturally causes fear for us. I'm trying to think of a good example for us in life. For us, that may be, I don't know. What's a good example of that? I got to think about that. A power that we don't know. I'm sure somebody has, maybe in your groups, you can talk about that. We'll talk about that here too. Before we break into groups, any questions of clarity or clarification? Anything in the story that we didn't touch on or that you want to push back on? I know the demon possession, it can be kind of a non-starter. So I appreciate you going with me on that journey for a minute and making some assumptions just for the sake of conversation. Happy to revisit any of that or answer any clarifying questions before we break into groups. Guys online?
Matt?
Yeah.
You did a beautiful visual of what took place. And this story is real familiar to most of us, I'm sure. I'm trying to place myself in that time and event. 2,000 pigs. Now, these people made a living off of these pigs, this herd of pigs. That was their lifeline. And 2,000 of them rushed down the bank and went into the sea and drowned. And that's devastating to them on an economic basis. They've never seen anything like that before in their lives. And that would scare me enough to where I'd say, go get back in the boat and leave. I mean, we don't need you here. And that would help me understand how the local folks would have felt about Jesus. And I can visualize this man certainly wanting to stay with Jesus because of first time in a very, very long time, evidently in his life, he felt human again.
Yeah, it's good, Johnny. Can y'all hear that? Yeah, good. I think you're right on, Johnny, and you hit a note that I missed in my notes. You're right. The economic impact on this shouldn't be lost. Part of the reason they want Jesus to leave is he just destroyed their economy, which I gotta think for a minute about what that might mean. But on the other hand, it's just pigs, so but you're right. You're right. That's part of the resistance. Because remember, this is a real story, real human people, right, that are involved here. Somebody's livelihood just got blown up, and that's a fair point.
And your question about the disciples and not hearing anything about them, they had just seen him calm the sea and speak to the wind and the sea and calm it. And then they step out of the boat, within an hour or so, 2 hours, whatever it took to cross. And then this event happens. I think you're right on. They probably stayed. They may have steadied the boat by getting out of it, but it's like, can you imagine this unfolding in front of you?
Yeah. Yeah. Good. Okay. Other questions of clarification before we break into groups? All right. Seeing none. Just a reminder, I think I sent like 5 questions or something. You don't need to answer all 5 questions. Not all 5 questions are good for you or for your conversation. I'm comfortable with that. Pick the questions that work for you. And if none of those questions work for you, dig into some other part of the story. You don't need to feel pressure to make it all the way through all the questions. So just choose the topics of conversation that are going to be helpful for you and for your group.